Welcome to this immersive explainer of everyday medieval life. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds usually jump straight to grand castles, armored knights, or sweeping political dramas. But history isn't just made in throne rooms. It's lived every single day by ordinary people who were just trying to feed their families, earn a living, and build trust in a really complex, unpredictable world. So today, we're going to reconstruct an entire human world from the ground up. We'll be looking directly through the experiences of the tradespeople, the consumers, and the civic officials who actually built the foundations of modern commerce.
Okay, let's dive into this. What was it actually like to navigate trust, justice, and survival in the muddy, noisy streets of a 13th century town? I want you to imagine the sensory reality for a second. You're walking down a narrow, deeply rutted lane. The air is thick with wood smoke, the pungent smell of raw leather, and the heavy aroma of brewing ale. Right beneath your boots, the street is this mix of mud and animal refuse. Everywhere you look, there's motion, shouting, and intense negotiation. In this explainer, we're going on a journey from these lively market stalls to the hidden, highly sophisticated systems of guilds, laws, and sanitation that actually kept this entire civilization from completely collapsing.
Part 1. The bustling medieval marketplace.
And this brilliantly illustrates how that marketplace actually functioned. In an era long before mechanical clocks, work is what structured the medieval day. The market was the ultimate hub of social interaction and trade, and its rhythms were entirely dictated by daylight and the ringing of civic and church bells. Workshops opened directly onto the streets, so the line between your home and your workplace was basically non-existent. But how did you know who to trust? Well, guilds were the answer. They were these incredibly powerful trade associations that strictly regulated who could work, how apprentices were trained, and the ultimate quality of the goods. And visible markers were absolutely everything for an illiterate populace. Artisans would use the tools of their trade, like a carved wooden boot above a door, a sheaf of wheat, or a massive set of shears, to guide citizens to trusted, guild-inspected goods. The product and the maker's reputation were inextricably linked.
Part 2. The assize of bread.
For the medieval working classes, bread was the absolute foundational calorie source, which made its supply a matter of critical political stability. To ensure affordable food, authorities instituted a really unique economic system. To understand how differently people in the past solved their problems, we have to contrast it with today. In our modern world, the weight of a loaf of bread stays exactly the same, but the price fluctuates based on inflation and supply. The medieval system, known as the assize of bread, flipped this entirely on its head. It kept the price of a loaf permanently fixed at a highly accessible coin, like 1 farthing. What fluctuated instead was the actual weight of the loaf, which was adjusted inversely based on the current market price of wheat right after the harvest. This provided incredible psychological stability to peasants, because they always knew exactly what a single farthing would buy them.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer mathematical precision of the era, which was perfectly preserved in translated legal texts from the 13th century. They detail exactly how much a farthing loaf must weigh when a quarter of wheat sells for 12 pence versus 18 pence, and so on. To enforce this, specialized market bailiffs, who were sometimes called catchpolls, rigorously policed these weights. They would physically assay the bread to ensure absolutely no baker was artificially shrinking their loaves to pad out their profit margins.
And if a baker thought they could pull a fast one and cheat this system, well, the consequences were highly physical and intensely public. Medieval consumer protection relied heavily on public shame as its primary enforcement mechanism. Cheating bakers could have their assets completely seized, or worse, they were literally paraded through their own streets with that underweight, offending loaf strung tightly around their necks. After that, they were locked in the pillory for the whole town to mock. It was serious business. Brewers who watered down their ale faced a similar fate in the tumbrel, which was a specialized chair used specifically for public humiliation.
Part 3. The Court of Pie Powders.
When trade started expanding beyond the local town during those massive annual fairs, traditional, sluggish feudal law just couldn't keep up. Transient merchants required specialized, immediate international trade law. Enter the Court of Pie Powders. This is such a magnificent term. It comes from the Norman French pied poudre, literally meaning dusty feet. It referred directly to the traveling merchants who arrived at the market with the literal dust of the roads still on their boots. These specialized summary courts completely bypassed local bureaucracies, delivering immediate justice to transient populations right there on the market floor. They dealt with everything from broken contracts to outright brawls.
The procedure here was shockingly efficient, totally abandoning medieval superstitions in favor of rational commerce. First, you'd get an immediate pretrial summons. Second, Instead of having a local lord decide the case, it was judged by a jury of 3 or 4 fellow, impartial merchants. These were guys who actually understood commercial customs, and they rely on physical evidence, contracts, and ledgers. Finally, if you lost the case and couldn't pay, the court authorized immediate distraint. That meant they would instantly seize your horses, your cart, or your goods right there on the spot to cover your debt.
So the crucial point here is the incredibly strict legal time limit of the system. By law, a decision in a pie-powder court had to be made within a day and a half of the initial accusation. In port cities, the rule was often stated as before the third tide. This was a brilliant constraint because it allowed traveling merchants to get a fair, binding verdict and pack up their stalls before the fair ended. It ensured that international trade kept flowing smoothly without ever getting bogged down by slow local bureaucracy.
Part 4. Tally sticks and finance. Coinage was chronically scarce in medieval Europe. And remember, the vast majority of people were illiterate. So how did they manage complex credit and debt? They used an incredibly elegant piece of financial technology, the Hazelwood tally stick. Rather than relying on written paper receipts, which would frankly mean nothing to someone who couldn't read, debts were recorded by using a knife to carve notches into a stick of seasoned hazelwood. The physical dimensions of the notches translated directly into financial values that anyone could instantly feel and understand. A notch the width of a thumb, that meant 100 pounds. A notch the width of a barleycorn was a shilling. It was quite literally physical, tactile accounting. But how do you prevent fraud with a piece of wood? This is where it gets genius. Once those notches were carved in, the stick was split cleanly in half lengthwise. Because the wood grain of every single hazelwood stick is entirely unique, much like a human fingerprint, the two halves could only ever fit back together with their exact original mate. The creditor kept the longer half, which was called the stock, and the debtor kept the shorter foil. If anyone tried to carve an extra notch later on to cheat the debt, the fraud was instantly obvious the very moment the halves were rejoined. It was a completely tamper-proof receipt. In fact, the Royal Exchequer relied on this exact system for centuries.
Part 5. Stench, miasma, and sanitation.
We have to remember that a medieval town was fundamentally a heavily agricultural space. Slaughtering happened directly behind the shops, creating this very visceral landscape of blood and offal. And for the medieval mind, this wasn't just gross, it was a terrifying medical emergency. According to miasma theory, which completely dominated medical science at the time, deadly diseases like the plague were literally transmitted by inhaling corrupt, foul-smelling air. Therefore, early urban sanitation laws were never about modern aesthetics or just wanting a pretty street. Cleaning up the blood and the stench was a literal matter of life and death, driven by an absolute dread of airborne infection.
You can actually hear the genuine fear and disgust in the primary sources of the era. In 1371, King Edward III personally intervened in London sanitation. He wrote a letter condemning, and I quote, "the corruption, the grievous stench, and the loathsome sight caused by the butchers of St. Nicholas Shambles." These guys were routinely dumping animal offal directly into the River Thames. The resulting stench was considered so medically dangerous that slaughterhouses were frequently ordered to pack up and relocate entirely outside the city walls.
Let's move on and see how this builds into the physical world, because these environmental fears shaped the very architecture of the cities themselves. Commercial spaces rapidly evolved to solve specific, localized problems. Take the famous York Shambles in England and compare it to the Mercato Vecchio in Florence. Down in Italy, the open rectilinear plan with wide awnings was absolutely perfect for sheltering colorful piles of fruits and vegetables. But up in York, a street entirely dedicated to butchers required a completely different, highly specialized urban design just to prevent their meat from rotting.
Every single inch of a street like the Shambles served a highly specific purpose. The timber-framed upper stories intentionally jutted out over the street below to plunge the stalls into shadow. This kept the raw meat out of the sun and shielded the fragile wattle and daub walls from the rain. The meat itself was displayed on these wide wooden sills called chammels. But most ingeniously of all, the cobbled pavements were deliberately raised on the sides, forming a deep central channel in the middle of the road. This wasn't some kind of medieval paving flaw. It was a built-in drainage system designed specifically so that butchers could wash the heavy volume of animal blood straight down the street twice a week.
So from the fixed price of a farthing loaf to the lightning-fast justice of those dusty-footed merchants and the tamper-proof grain of a split tally stick, the medieval world was certainly not a dark age of chaos. As we've seen, it was a civilization of immense ingenuity. They were constantly innovating to manage risk, to build trust, and to survive the incredibly harsh realities of their environment. They built their laws, their money, and their architecture specifically to master the unique constraints of their time,
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought. Centuries from now, when future historians look back at our digital ledgers, our sprawling zoning laws, and the architecture we leave behind, what story will they uncover about our daily pursuit of order and survival? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the history that's hidden in the world right outside your door.